Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As you may know, my side is the affirmative side of this debate, and we will be supporting the resolution that developed countries have a higher obligation to fight climate change. We are going to state three major arguments which show why developed nations have a higher obligation to combat climate change. Developed countries began the Industrial Revolution since the 1850s and have been producing global greenhouse gas emissions for over 150 years. The U.S. is the largest single source, accounting for 22% of the total, with carbon emissions per person now exceeding 5 tons per year. This is why developed nations, the nations that have caused this current situation, should be more obligated to combat climate change. The second reason why developed countries have a higher obligation to fight climate change is because they are wealthy enough to afford it. According to the Washington Post, the Iraq War has cost the U.S. $3 trillion. If the U.S. has enough money to spend fighting a useless war, they should have enough money to reduce CO2 emissions. With more money, developed countries are capable of developing new, cleaner technologies which they already have, which include solar, nuclear, wind, and clean coal technologies. The third reason why developing countries have a higher obligation is that developing countries are poor, they cannot afford to do it, and don't have enough resources to take care of their immediate needs. Developing countries don't have the technology to reduce climate change. Therefore, developed countries have a higher obligation to fight climate change.
Developed nations and developing nations are equally obligated to reduce their individual greenhouse gas productions. My opponent's idea is impractical. There is no effective way to enforce these limitations on the international system that exists today, which is one of independent nations. There is no world government that can enforce such a levy on developed nations. The Kyoto Protocol had one major flaw. It did not regulate developing countries. Trees consume CO2 from our atmosphere and convert it into oxygen. They are the lungs of the earth. Developing nations are cutting down thousands of trees yearly. If we continue to cut down trees, this will cause the earth to perish. Over the next 30 years, 90% of the world's population growth will take place in developing countries. This will cause even more pollution, but also it will produce a vast workforce to combat climate change. In those countries, large proportions of the population are children or teenagers who could contribute either to a large workforce or economic gains. In the absence of education and jobs, they will contribute to instability, crime, and conflict. Combating climate change will produce thousands of jobs, but if nothing is done, if current trends continue, the developing countries will account for more than half of the total CO2 emissions by 2035. If we just tax and limit the developed countries, companies that pollute will move their operations to countries that have nearly no policies regarding greenhouse gas pollution. A prime example is China. Recent figures have shown that China has already surpassed us in 2008, and they are continuing to climb in their CO2 contributions. All nations, developed or developing, should be held accountable and regulated equally concerning their contributions to climate change.
Would you state that, please? Say that the Kyoto Protocol is completely counterproductive.
Yes, we do believe that it's counterproductive.
How is it counterproductive?
Because it only puts regulation on developed nations and doesn't regulate developing nations, such as your plan does.
He says that our ideas are impractical. They might not like it, but it's what must be done for the good of the world to improve life everywhere. The Kyoto Protocol is not something to hold developing countries accountable for their greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, the Kyoto Protocol does not do something in contrast to what my opponent stated, that it lacks accountability and does not nothing about developing countries.
This is where their flaws lie. First, developing countries are also burning a great amount of coal and other fossil fuels. If restrictions are not put on them, soon they will be emitting toxins as much as developed countries. In fact, they emit and allow more CO2 to be emitted than developed nations. Some are even cutting down trees, thus preventing CO2 containment. Second, their own statistics have shown that being wealthy does not lead to a greener tomorrow. They stated that 60% of the world's wealthy population is consuming 80% of the world's natural resources, meaning that not all money is spent wisely. My opponents also state that the U.S. is the single largest source polluting CO2 emissions. However, this is not true because according to recent figures, China, a developing country, is now considered the largest single source of polluting CO2 emissions. Last but not least, economic status and technology should not determine one's ability to fight climate change. Developing countries have some of the best technologies in the whole world, and they don't have to do a huge investment on it because it's free. This technology is nature. If developing countries are not held accountable for climate change, just as developed countries are, then this great technology can be lost forever. Their industrial revolution will cause a great loss of such natural resources, and in addition, it will further climate change. Let's not repeat history, but rather learn from it.
Some companies have actually saved money by going green. Why can't other companies do the same?
Can you clarify where those companies will be located and what countries?
S.C. Johnson, Waxdale, and Michigan. 2 green energy turbines that power electricity and produce over 70 million cases of product.
That's a matter of economics. They have to produce to satisfy their customers, and no matter where they are always going to pollute, even a little bit or not. If your plan is what needed to be done to regulate developed nations, do you think that developing nations also need to be regulated since they are contributing, such as China, more than the U.S. to global warming?
The joint implementation mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol does do something about regulating developing countries. Here's a summary speech. Obviously, my opponent did not study the Kyoto Protocol's 3 mechanisms. So far, our opponent has stated that it is impractical. He said it lacks accountability, but obviously the joint implementation mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol refutes that. He called it impractical, but obviously it is what has to be done. And if other companies can go green and make millions of dollars a year, why can't other companies do the same? Outsourcing is a part of economics.
The U.S. did not accept the Kyoto Protocol because its first implementation did not have anything to do with developing nations. Our plan will regulate both sides, developing and developed nations. That is how it's going to work. If you regulate developed nations, and the developing nations over here keep doing whatever they want to do, how is your plan going to work? It's just contradictory to each other. And China's rich. Their government has loaned us over $1 trillion in our war effort. They are buying bonds to stimulate our economy from Obama. If China is classified as a third world country, how can they afford to do all this? They can obviously afford to combat climate change. You asked us, why do companies, they can save money by going green, right? And some aren't going green. You're asking, why don't they all go green? Well, I'm asking, why don't all countries help to combat climate change? Why don't all countries, developed and developing?
As presented by the Kyoto Protocol and its 3 mechanisms, developed and developing countries will help to combat climate change by creating a carbon market.
How is that relevant, seeing that it hasn't been ratified with the U.S.?
They've signed it. Obviously, if they haven't ratified it, it's not national. But there are other ways, as shown by the 3 mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol. There are other ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions without having to make them national laws.
What you speak of is a carbon limitation on nations. And if the nation reaches that limit, they cannot produce any more. And if another nation does not reach that limit, they can trade off that remaining limit to another one that wants to produce more. Is that what you speak of?
No. You guys said that the past doesn't matter, but obviously it does, because what we do now impacts the future. And the carbon footprints left behind from those 150 years of industrialization have obviously had a negative effect. You not see what's going on with the tsunamis and Katrina.
The Industrial Revolution started in 1850, and that has created the current situation where we're in now. Now, those were from undeveloped countries trying to get developed to how they are now. These undeveloped countries will most likely have to go through their own industrial revolution, which would create even more times. We have to change the future, not repeat the past.
Developed countries should have a high responsibility on combating climate change, which are they costed, they're more wealthy, and poor countries can't really do much.
All pollution is bad, no matter how large or small, and no matter from who it is produced by. In all fairness, equality, and non-partisanship, all nations of all economic classes and social levels should be held responsible and required to combat climate change.